Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Thomas Jefferson by Henry Moscow. Read by Pete Simonelli. 1. Planter's Son, 1743 to 1769. For as much as 100 miles inland from the Atlantic, Virginia lies flat. When the tide runs to shore, the sea surges up great rivers, the James, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, and the York, pushing their currents into reverse twice a day. The water brims onto the land, giving it the name tidewater. To the west, gentle hills swell from the plain. This is the Piedmont. In the 18th century, the tidewater was home to gentlemen planters, the Piedmont to pioneers. Thomas Jefferson was heir to both heritages. Tobacco was the reason people moved out of the comfortable tidewater to the forested hills. Growing the plenteous crop quickly exhausted the fertility of the land. After John Smith's first settlers had come to Virginia, others followed by the hundreds. Some, too poor to pay the passage money of £6 sterling, agreed to spend years working without wages for wealthier colonists who advanced their fare. They often planned to move to the Piedmont to start their own farms after they had cleared their debts. Soon after Jefferson's birth, the British and the French entered into their third war in half a century over North America. Between wars, nothing slowed the land rush. To acquire property, one applied to Virginia's royal governor, who ruled the colony with an appointed council and an elected House of Burgesses. If the land did not belong to Indians, and if the governor and his advisers believed the applicant was a solid citizen with a reasonable request, he usually got a patent on the property he wanted. Such lands had to be surveyed. Surveying, an adventurous and profitable business, attracted men like Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter, a tobacco planter and landowner himself. Peter had no schooling since none was available, and his mother, who might have taught him, died when he was 8. He educated himself, however, and the House of Burgesses chose him and Joshua Fry, a professor of mathematics at the College of William and Mary, to survey the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina. The year-round work was not only physically taxing, but hazardous. Each night, the two men made their beds high in hollow trees to avoid the wolves and wildcats that prowled below. Starvation was an even greater threat. To survive, Peter and Joshua sometimes were forced to eat their pack mules, and more than once the raw flesh of deer and bears they had shot. But Peter Jefferson was much more than a frontiersman. His family had prospered since the first Jeffersons arrived in America from Wales in 1612. The first House of Burgesses that convened in 1619 included a Jefferson. Peter's father had left him a large tract of land, along with horses, slaves, and livestock. Peter Jefferson married his best friend William Randolph's cousin, Jane Randolph, in October 1739. She was the daughter of Isham Randolph, Adjutant General of Virginia, a wealthy, well-educated, widely traveled man. The Randolphs had come to Virginia in 1674 and were related to many prominent families in the colony, including that of George Washington. Several years before Peter married, he and Randolph each acquired several thousand acres on the Rivanna River, a tributary of the James. Long afterward, Thomas Jefferson wrote proudly of his father. He was the third or fourth settler, about the year 1737, of that part of the country in which I live. When Peter wanted to build a house, he found that the best site lay on William's side of the stream. His friend signed over 200 acres to Peter in return for the largest bowl of potent arrack punch ever served in Williamsburg Raleigh Tavern. Shortly thereafter, William sold his friend another 200 acres, this time for £50. Thus, Peter could build Shadwell, the house where his son Thomas was born. Thomas Jefferson's earliest memory was of leaving Shadwell when he was 2 years old. A slave on horseback bore him on a pillow for 70 miles along wilderness trails to William Randolph's Tidewater estate, Tuckahoe. Randolph, dying, had begged Peter Jefferson to move to Tuckahoe, run the plantation, and raise and educate Randolph's son, Thomas Mann, and the boy's sisters, Judith and Mary. Shadwell was more difficult to get to than Tuckahoe. Ocean-going ships could not sail up the Rivanna. Tobacco had to be shipped by wagon or rolled along the trails in sturdy barrels to a wharf. At Tuckahoe, Thomas Jefferson got his first schooling with his 4 sisters, Jane, Mary, Elizabeth, and Martha, and the 3 Randolphs. The house at Tuckahoe, unlike Shadwell, was large and splendid. It was erected on a hill and had a beautiful view of the James. Approaching it, one passed through an avenue of great elms and surrounding gardens. Its chandeliered salon was frequently the site of dancing lessons for young men and women. When the Jeffersons finally moved back to Shadwell, Thomas's father sent him off to the Latin school, run by a crusty clergyman ordained by the Church of England, William Douglas. Home at Shadwell for vacations, Tom, as his family called him, rode in the forest, swam and fished in the Rivanna, and roamed the hillsides with his older sister Jane. He delighted in his father's volumes of Joseph Addison, William Shakespeare, and Jonathan Swift. He first hunted alone when he was 10. To make himself reliant, his father sent him into the forest with a gun. Tom was fairly discouraged until he discovered a wild turkey in a pen. Using a garter, he tied the bird to a tree, shot it, and proudly took it home. "Never ask another to do for you what you can do for yourself," Peter Jefferson liked to say, and he made sure his son knew how to sit a horse, ford a swollen river, and forge his way up and down the wooded hills. When Tom was 14, his father rescued him from Douglas and enrolled him in the log-house school of the Reverend James Maury, a clergyman of French Huguenot ancestry who had great enthusiasm for Latin and Greek. Tom soon became friends with a classmate, Dabney Carr. Unexpectedly that summer, Peter Jefferson, 49 years old, fell ill and died. In his will, he left most of his estate to his son and appointed 2 guardians, Peter Randolph and John Harvey, to watch over him. In the next year and a half, Tom proved wise beyond his years. In January 1760, he decided to go to college rather than continue private study. He had the support of Randolph and worked to convince Harvey in a letter written on January 14, 1760. "In the first place, as long as I stay at the mountain, the loss of 1/4 of my time is inevitable, by companies coming here and detaining me from school. And on the other hand, by going to the college, I shall get a more universal acquaintance, which may hereafter be serviceable to me, and I suppose I can pursue my studies in the Greek and Latin as well there as here, and likewise learn something of the mathematics." Harvey agreed, and in the spring of 1760, Thomas Jefferson set out, stopping at the home of Colonel Nathaniel West Dandridge of Hanover County. At one of the colonel's parties, he met a 24-year-old man who had already gone bankrupt as a storekeeper, but who fiddled and danced and jested with an enthusiasm that charmed Jefferson. The fellow had studied law only 6 weeks, but was confident he could pass the examinations for admittance to the bar, and he delighted Jefferson with a promise to look him up in Williamsburg. As Jefferson rode to William and Mary, he could not have known how closely the life of the young fiddler, Patrick Henry, would be linked with his own. Riding into Williamsburg a few days before his 17th birthday, Jefferson found the college disappointing, but the town, the largest he had ever seen, a delight. A visiting graduate of Oxford University was less impressed, writing, "It consists of about 200 houses, does not contain more than 1,000 souls, and is far from being a place of any consequence." The tiny town turned out to be a place of much consequence, and it was rarely dull. Planters spending the winter there often hired actors from London to amuse them with performances of Shakespeare and the comedies of William Congreve and William Wycherley. There were dice to roll, cards to deal, good wines to drink, and expensive dinners to eat in the elegant Raleigh Tavern. There were horse races, too, as well as cockfights, wrestling matches, and fiddling, singing, and beauty contests. William and Mary College, with fewer than 100 students, consisted of a grammar school, a philosophy school, and a divinity school. The main building, 66 years old when Jefferson arrived, was designed by the renowned British architect Sir Christopher Wren. The housekeeper was carefree, and the faculty had to admonish her to stop serving scraps for supper. Few students took the ban on keeping racehorses or fighting cocks seriously. Their dogs, their guns, and sometimes their slaves shared their rooms. There were supposed to be 6 professors at the college, all but one Church of England clergyman, but 2 of them rallied their students for a brawl with the town boys and lost their posts. 2 or 3 others were suing the college's trustees and were in England when Jefferson arrived in Williamsburg. Fortunately, the college had one teacher who was worth a whole university to Jefferson. He was a Scot named William Small, only 9 years older than Jefferson and the only non-clerical member of the faculty. He had, Jefferson later wrote, an enlarged and liberal mind, and held the unconventional view that a professor should not beat a student. Small began teaching mathematics, but as the faculty dwindled, he took on everything from grammar to astronomy and physics. During his first year in college, Jefferson rarely missed a horse race or a play. He danced as graceful a minuet as anyone at the Raleigh and could kiss a lady's hand with no sign of 17-year-old bashfulness. But he differed from other young men in Williamsburg. His thirst was for knowledge, not wine. His questions in class and his conversations out of class so impressed Small that he befriended Jefferson and introduced him to other friends, George Wythe and Francis Fauquier, the royal governor. Wythe had overcome poverty to become Virginia's best Latin and Greek scholar and one of its busiest and most respected lawyers. He was, however, thought to be eccentric. At his first opportunity, he freed his slaves and provided for their futures. Governor Fauquier was as merry as he was learned and wise. A Londoner, he was a member of the Royal Society and had accomplished the astonishing feat of writing an interesting, successful book on taxation. He was kind, generous, liberal in his views, and, with some allowances, as an early historian put it, he was everything that could have been wished for by Virginia under a royal government. Fauquier loved to entertain, and soon Jefferson was dining once a week with the governor, Small, and Wythe, and playing violin or a cello in Fauquier's chamber music concerts. At the dinners, Jefferson said he had heard more good sense, more rational and philosophical conversation than in all my life beside. Jefferson believed that knowing Small probably fixed the destinies of my life, and he looked to Small and Wythe and his kinsman, Peyton Randolph, as his role models. In a moment of temptation or difficulty, I would ask myself, what would Dr. Small, Mr. Wythe, or Peyton Randolph do in this situation? He omitted Fauquier because the governor loved to gamble, and Jefferson disapproved of gambling, even forbidding his slaves to possess dice or cards. Despite the important friends he had made, Jefferson was far from satisfied with himself at the end of his first year of college. Home at Shadwell for vacation, Jefferson began studying in earnest, tumbling out of bed at dawn. He kept at his books all day and often read until 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes, taking a book along, he would cross the Rivanna in his canoe and climb to a hilltop where he planned to build a house. He named the hill Monticello, which in Italian means Little Mountain. If Dabney Carr was visiting, the 2 of them would read and talk and sometimes roast a partridge for dinner under a great oak on the hill. They had come to love the tree so much that they agreed that when one of them died, the survivor would bury his companion beneath the tree. Back in college for his senior year, Jefferson maintained the same pace. All but abandoning friends, horseback riding, and even the violin, he studied 15 hours a day. Advice he wrote for friends provides insight into Jefferson's idea of time well spent. Till 8 o'clock in the morning, he recommended, one should study agriculture, chemistry, anatomy, zoology, botany, ethics, and religion. From 8 to 12, read law. From 12 to 1, read politics. In the afternoon, read history. He specified ancient, modern, English, and American. And, from dark to bedtime, he said, should be devoted to poetry, drama, and literary criticism, with Shakespeare's plays and Demosthenes and Cicero's speeches required reading. At twilight, Jefferson relaxed by running to a boulder 1 mile beyond the town limits, then back. When Jefferson graduated from William and Mary in the spring of 1762, he was able to read Greek and Latin, got along in French and Italian, and was eager to learn German and Spanish. He had read the ancient philosophers in their own languages, and had begun to sample John Locke and Montesquieu. He was well acquainted with the sciences. He had collected hundreds of distinguished books in a land where few people owned more than a Bible, and at 19 was one of the best educated men in Virginia. For this he credited Peter Jefferson, Maury, Small, Wythe, and Fauquier. He also credited his own philosophy. It is wonderful how much may be done if we are always doing. Next, he set out to become a lawyer. Planting was profitable, but hardly provided the mental exercise he craved. Dabney Carr was going to be a lawyer, too. So was their friend John Tyler, whose son John would become President of the United States. Patrick Henry, though he had failed at farming and innkeeping as well as shopkeeping, already was one. To the horror of George Wythe and the astonishment of others, he had passed the Virginia bar examination. There were no law schools. To become an attorney, a young man went to work for a lawyer and read his law books, ran his errands, helped prepare his briefs, and watched him in court. Small arranged for Wythe to teach the law to Jefferson. It was the perfect choice, and although Wythe later taught Jefferson's cousin, John Marshall, and had Jefferson's political opponent, Henry Clay, as a secretary, Jefferson remained his favorite pupil and his lifelong friend. When Wythe died, he left Jefferson his library. Patrick Henry's informal approach to the law, though successful, was not for Jefferson. Jefferson's study of law lasted 5 years. He was determined to know not only what the law said, but whether the French, Romans, or ancient Saxons had written it. He had to see how it had been phrased in the original, which meant, in the case of Saxon laws, he had to master the obscure and forgotten Saxon language. He considered whether laws still made sense or ought to be amended or repealed. Whenever he came across an interesting law, an important legal decision, or an intriguing philosophical idea, he copied it into what he called a commonplace book. Jefferson's book eventually had hundreds of detailed entries. Sharing rooms in Williamsburg, Jefferson and John Tyler studied into the night. When their roommate, Frank Willis, stabled his horse in the cellar and came upstairs after a rowdy evening, he sometimes had to upset their table and spill their law books to make them stop studying. But Jefferson also was finding time to manage the plantations he inherited, practice the violin 3 hours a day, ride his horse daily, make and record meteorological and astronomical observations, dine out, go to balls, attend the theater, and, of course, be on hand when interesting cases were tried in court. Jefferson was on hand for a significant case that involved his old teacher Maury, the professors who had been suing William and Mary when he entered college, and Patrick Henry. The argument dated back to 1758, when Jefferson was studying with Maury, who was an Anglican clergyman. The Church of England was the only recognized church in Virginia, and though half the population belonged to other denominations, everyone was taxed to pay the Anglican ministers' salaries, according to English practice. These salaries were payable in tobacco, but the 1758 tobacco crop was scant. Prices were up, and the value of money was down. The hard-pressed burgesses voted to pay the ministers 2 pence for every pound of tobacco that was owed them. The clergy protested. When Fauquier upheld the burgesses, the William and Mary professors sailed to England to complain. In London, the Privy Council decided in favor of the ministers, and in 1763 Maury sued to recover, in cash, the market value of 16,000 pounds of tobacco. The jury had only to say how much he should get. The decision would affect all other ministers, too. The burgesses hired Patrick Henry as their lawyer. Henry was not an elegant speaker. As a lawyer, he was at pains to prepare his cases, yet he demanded his fees in advance on the grounds that he kept no books. But as Jefferson said, his powers over a jury were so irresistible that he received great fees for his services. This was his first significant case, and Jefferson was there to listen. Undoubtedly, they had discussed the issues many nights in Jefferson's rooms. The court was jammed. Henry started badly, but soon found his pace and criticized the ministers so passionately that they left the courtroom. Then he denounced the king. His Majesty had forfeited all right to the people's obedience, Henry contended, by letting his Privy Council veto their legislature's act. When the minister's attorney protested that the gentleman has spoken treason, Henry only grew more daring. The jury was out 5 minutes. It awarded Maury 1 penny. In wild excitement, those in attendance bore Henry off on their shoulders. The clergy of Virginia had established law on their side, but the verdict was intended as a warning to the British government and to King George III, who took a more active part in the government than his grandfather and father, George I and George II, had. Virginians were loyal subjects of George III and considered themselves Englishmen. But when a Virginian said, "my country," he meant Virginia, and Virginians had been making most of their own decisions for a long time. Thomas Jefferson would play an important part in Virginia's struggle to keep the right to make her own decisions. 2. Penman of the Revolution, 1770 to 1776. Thomas Jefferson entered the General Court in Williamsburg knowing he would be opposing his old friend George Wythe, one of the colony's best attorneys. Win or lose, his client could not pay, and his chances of winning were slight. Jefferson's client was a mulatto slave named Samuel Howell, whose great-grandmother had broken a law passed in 1705. To punish her and admonish others, the church wardens had condemned her infant daughter to 31 years of slavery. While the young woman was a slave, she gave birth to Samuel Howell's mother. Howell's mother, too, was a slave, because another law, passed in 1723, extended the penalty to her. Now, in April 1770, Samuel Howell was still paying for his ancestor's offense. He had asked for Jefferson's help, and Jefferson had filed a lawsuit to compel Mr. Netherland, Howell's owner, to free him. "I suppose," Jefferson told the court, "it will not be pretended that the mother being a servant, the child would be a servant also under the law of nature, because, under the law of nature, all men are born free, and everyone comes into the world with a right to the personal liberty given him by the author of nature." Jefferson argued that the 1705 law that had enslaved Howell's grandmother had been intended to punish wrongdoers, not to oppress their innocent offspring, and that the 1723 act that enslaved Howell's mother was wrong. Neither act justified enslaving Samuel. Wythe, for the defendant, was about to answer, Jefferson later wrote, but the judge interrupted him and gave judgment in favor of his client. Samuel Howell remained a slave. But Jefferson did not lose many cases. A busy lawyer, his clients ranged from poor men like Howell to the wealthiest people in Virginia. Until a few weeks before Howell versus Netherland was tried, Jefferson lived at Shadwell with his mother, his invalid sister Elizabeth, and the twins, Anna Scott and Randolph, who were 12 years younger than he. Mary had been married 10 years. Martha had wed Dabney Carr. Jefferson's sister, Jane, had died. By 1770, Jefferson had been appointed Justice of the Peace and elected to the House of Burgess, and he was building Monticello, a house the likes of which Virginia had never seen. Jefferson had still another interest. The Rivanna was not navigable by cargo craft, and Jefferson wanted to determine if the river could be made navigable by engineering. At the age of 21, Jefferson ran his canoe through waters swirling around the rocks that obstructed the stream and decided they could be cleared. After the legislature had approved the project, he supervised the work, and the river soon was free of rocks. Later, shortly before he was elected president, Jefferson asked himself whether his life had benefited his country. To find the answer, he wrote down his accomplishments. The clearing of the Rivanna River was listed along with writing the Declaration of Independence. After the Rivanna project was underway, 23-year-old Thomas Jefferson set out for New York. The first day, the horse that pulled his carriage bolted twice, nearly killing him. The second day, he was drenched by a 2-hour thunderstorm. The third day, when he was fording a stream, the water rose to the cushion of his carriage, and one wheel barely surmounted a boulder. When he finally reached Philadelphia, although it was considered a dangerous procedure, he had himself inoculated against smallpox. Traveling between Philadelphia and New York, Jefferson witnessed the use of all types of currency: British shillings, Portuguese crowns, Spanish pieces of 8, Dutch ducatoons, French écus, and louis d'or. To further complicate matters, each colony printed its own paper currency. The confusion of cash was a nuisance Jefferson wished he could eliminate. 20 years later, he did. Jefferson was always busy with more than one project at a time. The building of Monticello began in 1767, the same year that Wythe transformed him from student to lawyer. Jefferson had 68 cases that year, a huge number for a fledgling attorney, and in the fall session alone, he had to appear at courthouses in Staunton, Orange, Culpeper, Winchester, Fauquier, and Richmond. But he still found time to supervise construction of his house. After Governor Fauquier died in 1768, George III appointed Norborne Berkeley, Baron de Botetourt, governor of Virginia. Following a regal reception in Williamsburg in October, Botetourt called for elections for the House of Burgesses. Jefferson decided to run for a seat in the House. Although he was only 25, he was already a man of standing. His clearing of the Rivanna River had impressed many people. Despite the fact his campaigning was limited to serving punch to those who stopped by Shadwell, which was near the Charlottesville courthouse where the voting took place, he easily won the election. On February 1, 1770, Shadwell caught fire and burned to the ground. Jefferson was distraught at the loss, especially of the library. In a letter to his friend, John Page, he lamented the destruction of every paper I had in the world and almost every book. Jefferson estimated that the books were worth £200 sterling. I wish it had been the money, he said. He found refuge with friends and hastened work on Monticello, and by November, a little brick cottage, a tiny part of his plan, stood ready. About the time Jefferson moved into the cottage, he met Martha Wales, a young widow and the daughter of a fellow lawyer, John Wales, of the Forest Plantation. Jefferson soon was sending his servant to the Williamsburg Theater to hold seats for 2. He often visited Martha at her home and played the fiddle while she accompanied him on the harpsichord. His revived interest in music made Jefferson dissatisfied with his old violin. He knew of a splendid violin, but it belonged to a cousin, John Randolph, and John would not sell it. Finally, Jefferson made such a pest of himself that the cousins drew up an imposing document witnessed by Patrick Henry and George Wythe. If Randolph died first, Jefferson got the violin. If Jefferson died first, Randolph could choose £200 worth of his friend's books. Jefferson acquired the violin long before his cousin died, and it was a sad day for both when he did. There was only gaiety at the Forest on New Year's Day, 1772, when Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales Skelton married. The Waleses' plantation home, a tall, ungainly wooden house, sat on a knoll overlooking the James River. The wedding was extravagant, even by Virginia standards. 2 ministers presided over the ceremony, and Jefferson hired fiddlers to play as he and his 22-year-old bride walked down the aisle. The newlyweds stretched the celebration over 2.5 weeks of dancing, revelry, and hunting, finally setting out for Monticello on January 18th. After stopping at Tuckahoe, the couple drove their carriage through the worst blizzard in decades. The heavy snow fell steadily, piling up drifts as high as 4 feet that slowed their progress to a slog. It was dark when they arrived at the foot of Jefferson's mountaintop estate, and the slaves and laborers he had hired to build his mansion were asleep. Husband and wife had to swap their exhausted horses for a pair borrowed from a neighboring plantation to make the climb to Monticello's summit. The main house was still only half done and impossible to heat, so they huddled by a fire in the brick building now known as the Honeymoon Cottage. Jefferson shared his grand plans for Monticello with Martha, laying out sketches as they sat on a rug in the cottage. Jefferson spoke of the classical style inspired by Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio, whom he had studied in college. He was determined that his home would be different from dull, box-like American houses, which he called ugly and uncomfortable. To Jefferson, Monticello was more than a home. Its clean, simple lines and careful symmetry were a model for Americans struggling to create order out of the chaotic wilderness. The next morning, Jefferson wrote in his garden book, where he kept a careful record of the growth of his flowers and plants and orchards.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?